So I now have an excuse for a 5th series. This will be a series where I look at videos done on me and commentate on those. I've got 2 on the burner that I want to hit, and while I'll get to Lucksters later, I want to hit Doodletones' newest video on me, because Doodle throughout this video, makes excuses, dodges most of my points, and exaggerates points to make them seem like problems, and people just accepted it without looking too deep into it. As per usual with a Doodle video.
The link in the description is only there to see the source material. Do not under any circumstance go to these people with the intent to be a dick. I don't support witch hunts or lynch mobbing, so don't be either. As for the subjects themselves, my video is for the purposes of criticism and entertainment. Take it or leave it. My content is not here to start drama. Please do not treat it like it is.
Dude, can't wait for Lucas to come and tell me how much he fucking loved my original video, or how Robot just made a commentary to make one.
So much for not wanting to start drama. What does Lucas C have to do with your video? It seems like you brought him up for no other reason outside of because he thought your video wasn't very good. What other reason would there be for you to bring him up like that?
Okay, so generally speaking, at first I thought this was an okay video.
So allow me to bring up a slight nitpick I have with these first moments, particularly the half-assed credit to the artists you used art from. That doesn't actually give anyone credit. If you're going to use someone else's fan art of a series and give them credit, credit the individual artists so people can go and see their other works. Otherwise this doesn't help the artists who drew the art you use.
I thought it brought up some good points against me, and I felt my recent countdown about collectathons was very awkward, and even still I think there are things that I could have done better. But the more I watched this video, the more I started coming to the conclusion that Pink Robot's video on me is 300% garbo.
This statement will become important later.
Yes, for those who remember the name, Pink Robot has done another video on me. In fact, she's done 2 extra videos on me now. One I can't necessarily argue, surely due to the fact I wouldn't know how to.
She's referring to the walking contradiction video, by the way. I bring this up because she doesn't, thus making anyone who hasn't seen that video lost. And while it's a small thing, you claim you wouldn't know how to argue it. You're a commentator, the video is about you. How would you not know how to argue my walking contradiction video if you had actual faults with it? I feel like you're more using this as a method of damage control, if anything.
But one is a legitimate commentary on me that isn't trying to troll.
As if that would matter.
That's what I'll be covering today. Long story short, let's begin.
It's about time I do a commentary on Doodle herself. I was going to cover her video on Umbrus, but not only is it disowned now, meaning she won't listen to a word I say, but SketchTB also covered it just fine and I would do it no justice. However, Doodle released a countdown that has its own brand of flaws that I would like to cover. Her top 10 collectathons list is probably the best example of how she's not just bad at commentaries, but bad at countdowns too.
1 video, out of what, 9? Spoiler alert, you don't tie anything you bring up in this video to my other countdowns. Essentially, this is you making a statement that because one of my videos is a little less than par, all of my videos in that category are also less than par. Which becomes really unfortunate to you, given, well, this one.
That's not what I was trying to do. I was merely informing my audience that if they were to watch any of your other countdowns, people would be able to find the same general faults that I bring up in my original video. Which you can. In your top 15 most disliked characters list, you barely explain anything about what the characters are or what they do, especially seen within your Rickstro, Hamsker, Candy Kong, Crazy Professor, and Moneybags segments. In your top 10 obscure games list, it feels like the list is out of order considering you explain bigger issues with Anti-Grav than you do in Beg for Mercy. In your top 10 favorite animes, you bring up a lot of negative issues with animes you like, which feels like you're undermining the rest of your list, especially in regards to your number 3 segment being an anime you strongly recommend to people who want to get into anime, but your number 2 being one you admit isn't for everyone. I could go on, but I believe 3 examples is good enough.
I sure love me some collectathons. Being probably the most of what I played as a child, the 3D collectathon genre was probably one of the best things to happen to the 64-bit era, and recently in 2017 had a huge resurgence with the likes of The Hat in Time, Yooka-Laylee, and Mario Odyssey.
Huge resurgence means 3. I don't know how you expect me to believe the genre made this massive comeback from its heyday of the late 90s and early 2000s if you only have 3 examples for us to go off of.
Okay, how's this? 3, in comparison to the none that we've had for 7 years. The last explicitly 3D collectathon that we had was Super Mario Galaxy 2 in 2010. I even imply that in the Banjo-Kazooie segment given my footage, but we'll return to that point later.
This dodges the problem. My problem is with the fact that in your original countdown, you only gave your audience 3 examples to explain how the genre had this huge resurgence, and didn't even give us a form of comparison to go off of to understand how dead the genre was to begin with. Giving us the explanation now wouldn't change the problem in the original video.
That said, say you want to consider Super Mario 3D World. That's still a 4-year gap between 1 3D collectathon and 3 3D collectathons, which, as far as this dead genre is concerned, is a big resurgence.
Not really. Just because there wasn't a new collectathon every year wouldn't imply that the genre is overall dead. If we were to use that logic in a scenario where you're talking about just series, it would be an even bigger problem. Saints Row, Gat Out of Hell is 3 years old and Grand Theft Auto 5 is 5 years old. Would that mean gang-based sandbox action adventures are a dead genre? If so, then I'm curious to know if you're aware that Red Dead Redemption 2 is coming out in October.
It may not be late 90s, early 2000s big, but there's no denying that there was a significant spike in 2017.
But those of us who don't follow collectathon platformers wouldn't know that if we just watched your original countdown. That's the point.
I'll actually be keeping this point on the back burner for later, because there's an interesting point you bring up later that continues to make this weird.
Like, how dead was the genre? How does Yooka-Laylee, A Hat in Time, and Super Mario Odyssey show that they're coming back?
Inherently? I guess it doesn't, but I even bring up just after this interjection that I hope the surge stays on its course, implying I don't know if they'll return to the group with the other genres, but instead that I hope it does. Recently in 2017 had a huge resurgence with the likes of A Hat in Time, Yooka-Laylee, and Mario Odyssey. And here's hoping to that sticking. Could you have, I don't know, maybe let my point finish before asking such a question?
That only makes the issue worse though, because a resurgence implies an increase or revival after a period of little activity, popularity, or occurrence. Telling us that this spike in activity might not be permanent isn't a resurgence, it's a spike in activity, and you telling us otherwise continues to misinform your audience.
It's 12:30.
And here I thought the video was 300% garbo, as you put it. If you can't argue, then that must mean that my argument isn't as bad as you're making it out to be, implying an over-exaggeration to the problem. Also, you may want to shorten that skip card. I believe it's longer than any of the other skip cards you played throughout this video and does feel like it drags a bit.
And here's hoping to that sticking. I like collectathons as they tend to allow you to play them in any order with various new things to learn as you do. They really are the speedrunner's best friend.
This is also not explained upon. You explain how the game can be played in any order, but I fail to see how that's more beneficial to speedrunners in comparison to any other genre of game.
Okay, so this doesn't really matter at the end of the day as it has no bearing to what I'm actually talking about. It's merely a side note to the rest of my intro statements introducing collectathons.
Which I bring up as a problem later, but I suppose we'll hold off on that for now.
But if you really require an explanation, collectathons are simply easier to practice speedrunning in, given the goal of a collectathon game is to collect a number of MacGuffins to continue on. A speedrunner can utilize this goal to find shorter methods of continuing and work on shortening their time, in turn. Of course, this is in reference to glitchless speedruns, as speedruns that play a lot with glitches probably won't give too much of a fuck regardless. In fact, the typical practice game there is Ocarina of Time. Regardless, the openness to a collectathon game allows you to find the shortest route to your goal, which is what a speedrun is. It's in the name.
In a glitchless speedrun though, wouldn't a more linear style of game be the more suitable practice game? Because in a linear game, you can learn the patterns and enemy placement enough to avoid all the obstacles you can and improve your time that way. At the end of the day, this seems like you're arguing an opinion where a factual statement was trying to be made.
Now, care to not get on my case for an irrelevant statement that really means nothing to my video?
If it's irrelevant, why did you put it in the countdown? Also, what does this have to do with your list?
Nothing, but that's not the point of a drive-by statement like that, which is why I didn't dwell on why collectathons are great for speedruns.
That wouldn't change the fact that it was overall a useless statement to make in the video that had no bearing on your list at all and thus shouldn't have been there to begin with. In fact, The only thing telling me this does is validate the statement that it has no bearing on the subject, which validates my statement. You're not a speedrunner, you don't play off of the fact that these games are a speedrunner's best friend, you just drop this onto us and explain nothing.
I wonder if you'll short circuit in water.
I wonder if you know what that implies.
So, because this seems to be common confusion, I'll try to explain what I mean by collectathon. Or at least, what I mean when I say collectathon.
So is your own personal definition not the correct one? Doodle, if you want to clear up the air to what a collectathon actually is, considering there doesn't seem to be an actual definition for people to look at that would give us a concrete idea, your definition cannot be exclusive to you, otherwise, if we go to someone else who thinks of collectathons differently than you, your definitions may not match up, and it will cause even more confusion. For instance, I found a Reddit post that brings up 2 other ideas of a collectathon that do not at all match with yours. Being a collectathon is either any game that is based on the premise that in order to make progress in the game, you must collect a threshold of items. It is a mechanic of necessity where it would be impossible to complete/beat the game, excluding hacks, if you did not collect one of the possible many different in-game collectibles. Or is more defined by the sheer amount of different things you need to collect, with a high quota of items to collect altogether, which would exclude a couple of entries from your list entirely. But that's the problem, we can't know for certain just what the fuck a collectathon is, because you're specifying that your definition is exclusionary to you, which clears up nothing about the genre.
Robot, do you at all realize how fucking retarded this tangent was? You start this whole interjection by telling me how there doesn't seem to be any agreed upon definition to a collectathon, and even cement it with your little Reddit post, all while getting onto my case for explaining what my definition to a genre that doesn't even have an agreed upon definition actually is. Fucking hell, you want me to explain things in regard to how dead the genre is and how they connect to speedruns, but the minute I explain my thought process, suddenly your circuits go oof and get onto my case for explaining.
The reason I wanted you to explain the 2 prior examples was because you brought them up only to drop them, which would confuse an audience member who stumbles across your video. Mentioning those things meant nothing to your video, but you still felt the need to bring them up without explanation. The reason why I'm getting onto your case about the collectathon definition is because when you take into regard that others have their own idea of what a collectathon is, your version may be contradictory to others.
Yeah, my definition may be different to of Asriel's there, but that's the thing when a terminology that has no definition comes into play. You have to explain what you mean when you say it, otherwise everyone will be lost.
People will be confused regardless.
I'll also try to touch on more important aspects of Collectathon 2, being level design, the main character's moveset, difficulty, and how much the player requires to collect.
Of which she barely goes through with at all.
Hold on, let me finish.
Regardless, you don't bring any of those notes up later anyway, so whether or not it matters to where everything is at on your list is irrelevant. You say you're going to bring up these aspects of the games, but you very rarely do.
That said, these aspects won't necessarily sway my opinion on these games, as I just want to look at the games based on how much fun I had playing them.
We'll come back to that. On another note though, why would you mention any of these things if they aren't important to where they're at on the list? The lack of criteria doesn't work in your favor.
Robot, the reason I would bring up all of these aspects is to explain the pros and cons to the game as a whole, because surprise surprise, just explaining that I had fun with the game for a minute at a time would get really repetitive and really boring really fast.
That's why you have a criteria, you spurg. You can talk about where it's at and why it's exist on the list without having to pad out your entire list with useless shit that doesn't mean anything to itself.
The fun aspect regarding my list merely explains the placement. The other things I bring up explain the games. Oh, but this will come back a few times throughout your commentary, and that's going to be something.
Only once of which you ever bring up, by the way. Nice to see that you overlooked that aspect.
On top of that, Rocket controls very nicely, and with the various abilities you get along the way, his movement becomes rather impressive. It's a common practice in collectathons to have to unlock certain power-ups so the player can backtrack to those levels and gather previously unobtainable collectibles. And Rocket is no exception. However, the backtracking with Rocket not only is pretty minimal, but feels less like needless padding for the sake of challenge, and actually feels important to the rest of the game. Looking at you, Donkey Kong, you sadistic monkey. I love you.
Once again, we'll come back to this. But here I'm continued left with more questions. With backtracking in video games, aren't they typically pivotal for them?
No, they aren't. Even if they were, it wouldn't change how annoying backtracking can be to a player either. You'll often hear players complain about massive amounts of backtracking in a game, as it just feels really sluggish and creates what's known as artificial length to games.
What the fuck is artificial length? Where the hell is your evidence that people complain about this? She does bring up an example, but as you'll see, there are issues with it too.
Take Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door as an example. There are people who really don't like the backtracking in that game, especially under the regards of the general White Quest, and the amount of times you have to travel between Twilight Town and the creepy steeple.
Where is your evidence that multiple people complain about this? This is a rather interesting claim you make without any evidence to back it up. Is there any screenshots? Any clips you can play to show people complaining about either of these aspects? Of course not, because that would require effort.
People like progression, and a game that causes a lot of backtracking takes away that feeling of progress.
Would the story not give the player a feeling of progress though? Why do you make the assumption that progress only affects the different zones that a player travels to? Again, if there's any chance that people complain about this, it would have helped if you showed it to us.
You can't touch this.
Unfortunately for our little circus bot though, I can only keep him so high on the list as my experience with him is very limited.
Yes, but I thought your main criteria was regarding how much fun you had in that time frame, so why does the fact you have a limited experience with the game matter when that's not a part of your criteria?
Because, Robot, say you play a game for 30 minutes, either because that's all the time you had, or the power shuts down, or some outside cause. Would you say that you had a lot of fun playing it, or would you say you had a little fun playing it?
I would imagine it all depends on how good the game is. You could have as much fun with a 2-hour game with a game as long as Skyrim. Length shouldn't dictate how much fun a person can have playing a game. However, if that's the logic you want to go with, why aren't the longer games on this list higher than a game as short as A Hat in Time? Which was tied for first place with Super Mario 64, a game that, since you want to bring up speedrunning, can be beat in 6 minutes, which should make it lower.
Yeah, my criteria is how much fun I had playing it, but Rocket Robot on Wheels is lower because of the amount of fun I had in the time frame that I had played it, being the 5 hours on the Collectathon stream compared to other Collectathons I've played. This shouldn't be that hard.
But that wouldn't change anything. If Rocket Robot is lower because you didn't have as much fun with it, why didn't you just say that instead of making an excuse that it's because you didn't play it as long? It would make your list make more sense.
Oh no!
As far as the level design goes, didn't you just finish complimenting the level design and how big it is?
The level designs are huge to begin with and only get bigger when you expand each world, and throughout that each level gives you a lot to do despite the small number of levels overall.
And now you're complaining about how big the levels are by telling your audience how lost you get in them? How did no one catch the blatant contradiction there?
Implying that me saying I get lost playing it can only refer to the levels and not the objectives in the game?
You should have explained it better, because being lost as you described it, would imply that the size of the levels cause you to lose your place in the level. If it was the objectives, you should have made it more clear.
Robot, you bring up in this very same interjection a point against me saying that you can't keep track of your individual progress, which should tell you that keeping a checklist of what it is I'm supposed to do seems to be non-existent to me. Well, grant you point out how I'm wrong, even though I was more referring to keeping track of what you need to do and not how many pages you found.
So wait, was I right to call you out on that? Or were you referring to something I wasn't talking about? This makes actually no sense. This interjection was contradictory in nature.
Point is, I get lost figuring out what more there is to do, not where I'm at in the level. If I just get done explaining that I like the size of a level in the game, then odds are, size is not what I'm talking about.
Are you implying you can't be contradictory? I have an entire video that proves otherwise that you even said, you couldn't argue against. I mean, I know this is Doodle, so contradictory statements is PAR for the course, but that doesn't mean you have to turn a blind eye to it.
The fuck is that supposed to mean?
It means people often look over your contradictions. Are you paying attention?
Speaking of rare, when people need examples to what the hell a collectathon platformer is, the two prime examples that I tend to give out are the two most famous names in the genre, because that tends to be how examples work, right? We of course have the granddaddy of collectathons himself, Mario, the only guy who's been keeping the collectathon platformer even remotely still alive in the eyes of the public.
Are we just going to ignore Poi? A game that you put in your own intro.
You know how some commentators ask the target how they could ever make a point so stupid or miss something so obvious as a joke to overplay their anger and confusion? Yeah, no, I'm legitimately confused as to how Robot made this claim and not see the issue with it.
Top Keck.
It's so surreal, really. Robot knows of a game as obscure as Poi in order to make the argument that Poi was a game that kept the genre alive in the eyes of the public, which it didn't, but whatever.
Where's your proof of this? Because I have proof that the game is more well known than you make it out to be, given it won 3 awards.
However, Robot doesn't know that Poi is also a game that came out in 2017, going back to the earlier point of how 2017 was more of a resurgence to the collectathon genre. On top of that, did you forget 2017 was also the same year Odyssey came out anyway? Because I didn't. Mario is still the series that kept the collectathon genre even remotely alive.
No, I didn't either, but Doodle, did you forget Poi had a Kickstarter in 2015? Very akin to a Hat in Time? I didn't. People knew of Poi from said Kickstarter, so Mario isn't the only keeper of the collectathon genre.
And then we got Rare's Baron Bird mascot duo. I suppose, yeah, their first game is rather low for it being one of my prime examples of the genre, but sad to say, I didn't grow up with it like many others did.
But if this is one of your main examples to what a collectathon is, it shouldn't matter if this is one you grew up with. An example to what the genre even is, should be enough to put it higher, as that would show that Banjo is a game you think of as a pinnacle to the genre itself.
Actually no, not at all. Just because Banjo is one of the most well-known examples of a collectathon, that doesn't mean I have to enjoy it more than anything else. Like, I even said that Banjo is just one of the most famous examples to what the crap a collectathon is. Not that it's one of my favorites, just that it would be one people would understand more.
I'll come back to this, because here in a little bit you contradict this whole interjection. You're not going to use a game like Rascal to describe this genre, are you? No. Because that's not the best examples.
I'm now really confused as to what you're trying to argue, Robot. Are you trying to imply that the quality of the games matters to the examples? Like, yeah, you wouldn't use Rascal for an example of a collectathon, but not because it's a bad game, because not too many people would know what Rascal is, just as you wouldn't use Jersey Devil or Poi, regardless of quality. I could use Bubsy 3D as an example because it's a well-known example of a collectathon. Diddy Kong Racing is technically a collectathon, it's like the only collectathon racer. Spyro, Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, the Precursor Legacy, there's a few others I could bring up, because they're well enough known. Go figure.
So if you can use all these other examples, why do you explicitly use Super Mario 64 and Banjo? If Spyro, Ty, Bubsy, and others can be used as the prime examples, using Banjo in particular would imply that you think of that higher. Regardless of how popular it is, you choose to only bring up the 2 examples as your main 2.
I'm not too familiar with each of the level layouts and goals as everyone else is, and personally I find the controls to be rather wonky in comparison to practically every other collectathon I've played. As with most other collectathons in this caliber, it gets easier to have fluid movements as you're traversing each level. With Banjo-Kazooie, I never got that impression, personally.
Then why is this game above both Rocket Robot on Wheels and Yooka-Laylee? Especially since the former you didn't grow up with either, and the latter you straight up describe as does Banjo's problems better, with your main outlook being the controls. This doesn't make any sense being here, especially this high up.
Simple. I had more fun with it. I explained that in the Rocket Robot on Wheels segment that I didn't play it for very long and thus couldn't really fully experience it enough to have a higher opinion of it.
But if you didn't grow up with Banjo either, wouldn't that put Rocket Robot on Wheels on the same level as it? It's essentially the same problem.
And in the Yooka-Laylee segment, I explained that I have a grocery list of other issues with it outside of the control scheme. I did say that it did Banjo's problems better, I won't deny that, but it was in substitute for its own problems that I summarized even within the entry.
Yes, but you also bring up how you have played Yooka-Laylee multiple times, implying you still had more fun with that, due to the fact it did Banjo's problems better, especially considering that's the only thing you bring up against Banjo. Could you not have audio balanced this better? It's significantly louder than the rest of your video. On top of that, Why would it matter if it's good for the genre it's in when your only base criteria is how much you enjoyed playing it? Given your intro statements to the entry, we can obtain how you don't much care for it, and how you harp on the game for having bad controls. You obviously don't have that much fun with it, regardless of how good a collectathon it is.
Simply not true. You can still find faults within a game, but enjoy it enough to not really care that much. And while, yeah, gameplay can be a big problem with the game, it's almost as if that's why Banjo isn't higher on the list.
That's not the point, Doodle. The point is that you seem to not have that much fun with Banjo anyway, given how much you harped on the gameplay aspects of it, which you did seem to do a lot in the original video. I never said you couldn't have problems with a game you still have fun with, otherwise all of your original countdown would be garbage. I was simply stating that the way you treated Banjo in your segment seemed like you didn't actually have that much fun with it.
The downside with Donkey Kong's level design, however, and I'm sure we've all heard this complaint before, is that everything is kind of segmented with an awful amount of backtracking, and in some levels it can become a smidgen tedious, especially given some of the later levels being obnoxiously big.
If backtracking is such a big problem, then why is Rocket Robot on Wheels and Banjo not still higher on this list than Donkey Kong 64? As in both of those segments you talk about how there is very little to no backtracking there. Why does Donkey Kong get a pass to have backtracking, despite having it worse than any of the others on the list too, as told by your number 10 segment?
However, the backtracking with Rocket not only is pretty minimal, but feels less like needless padding for the sake of challenge, and actually feels important to the rest of the game. Looking at you, Donkey Kong, you sadistic monkey. I love you.
This, along with so far everything else, has shown me that your list was very haphazardly put together with no real care or effort put into it, and we're less than halfway through the list.
Way to assume things, Robot. It's almost as if I look at other things outside of merely backtracking, and Donkey Kong 64 gives me that ability. Like, you know, level design, which I bring up in the segment.
Yet, you also bring up how the level design puts the player into a situation where they have to backtrack a lot, which can be annoying given some of the levels can be bigger than needed. I could connect this to your top 10 bullshit levels list where you bring up Gloomy Galleon in particular, and how in that list, you complain about how segmented and large it is, and, surprise surprise, how much it requires you to backtrack. Also, keep in mind how long my original video plays for, it'll be important later.
I do suppose it's a little weird for that to be my only thing when Toy Story 2 gave me more things to talk about, but you act as if backtracking is my main outlook on games.
It doesn't help when that's one of the bigger reoccurring things in your list, given the Rocket Robot on Wheels, Toy Story 2, Donkey Kong 64, and Banjo segments. There you go again with the don't know how to argue shit. Why are you a commentator again?
So back to the idea of licensed games being not that bad all the time, we come to one that I don't know if it was predicted to be playable, but is, and is somehow really good. I don't know why, but SpongeBob games are oddly consistently good with only a few black sheep surrounding the series that I'm aware of. I mean, they certainly have their fair share of issues, but generally speaking, they're not only really fun games, but have some replayability to them. Now, while I like the game based on the movie, despite how patternistic it can be, and Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is Battle for Bikini Bottom is easily better of the Collectathon SpongeBob titles. Okay, this is actually bothering me, so I think it's time to point it out here. This padding needs to stop. I get it's only for 40 or so seconds here, but Jesus, you do nothing with that extra time. It just continues to drag for seemingly no purpose. I know you can speed up footage. I've seen you do it.
Unscripted Kirby. It's always a good time when this happens. So, can we talk briefly about this little issue that honestly bugs me when it comes to commentaries and all that stuff? And I've heard the complaints, and before you repeat the point in the comment section, we just address them really quickly.
Why don't you do it for this? Especially when there's like 2 minutes of context played out at a time sometimes.
That's very hypocritical coming from someone who doesn't speed up anything themselves. I don't care if hypocrisy doesn't make you incorrect, as some spurks in the commentary community like to throw out there. If you're going to get onto my case for not speeding things up, the least you could do is speed things up yourself, which we've also seen you do given you've done so in videos yourself. Hell, earlier there was a literal 2 minutes of my video played where you played Pizza Time over my point, and my point wasn't sped up. thus making you the worst offender of this problem, especially since you also didn't really touch on my entire point, but instead just the beginning segment. If you want me to take you seriously as a commentator, practice what you preach.
It plays as your typical collectathon, but works in its own way that allows you to collect your MacGuffin of the game, the golden spatulas, as you work towards an end goal in kind of a side questy sort of way.
Doodle, I don't know how you didn't see that you described games like Sly Cooper and the Tedious Racoonus, a game that you said was excluded from this list. The first Sly game was entirely built on the concept of getting the keys to unlock a mechanism so that Sly can get to the boss of the area, and collect the pages for the Tedious Racoonus. At the end of the day, the keys were merely a side quest to the main goal of page collecting.
Cool, except no. Outside of the main 5 pages that you get through the story, none of the other pages are required to finish the game. What is required to finish the game are the keys, the things you get at the end of each level. Meaning, Sly's just a typical platformer, not a collectathon. Battle for Bikini Bottom, on the other hand, requires you to collect the golden spatulas throughout a level in order to unlock the other levels, including the sock spatulas and shiny object spatulas. Thus, a collectathon. The game's main goals are barely even comparable.
One, you collect keys by going through various levels or completing various mini-games in order to get. The other has you collect spatulas by going through various levels or completing various mini-games in order to get. Where is this difference you speak of, especially given how you describe it in your countdown? Once again, you're trying to explain away my points, when in your original video it's worded in such a piss-poor way that no outsider would know what you're talking about. Generally, the last 2 entries are fine. My only complaint is the tie for first place, but that's not particularly a big deal, as you can see, for a person who's known for getting onto countdowns cases for not sticking to a criteria and breaking their own rules. Doodle's not particularly good at keeping that herself.
You haven't once told me exactly how I broke my criteria or rule.
What are you talking about? You breaking your criteria was my biggest point regarding Donkey Kong 64 and the Banjo segments especially, and Battle for Bikini Bottom breaking your rules was also a point of contention I had against your list. I bring both ideas to the table. You saying otherwise is a blatant lie.
There were times you got on my case for padding out my list, times where the placement seemed a little off, and overall pointed out stuff that seemed valid at face value until you looked more into it. But never did a broken criteria get brought up, nor broken rules.
I love how you have to clarify that you thought I had made good points after calling my commentary 300% garbage. That's a nice little touch. Regardless, don't you think me pointing out how the list being off implies that your criteria wasn't kept up with, even going by your own logic? If you can sit there, list that off as a point that I get onto your case about, and not see that as me bringing up how you barely follow along to your criteria, then you're denser than you initially come off as.
Unless you're trying to say the tie was a broken rule, but in that instance I didn't add on to an 11th entry, I just covered 2 at once, so there's no broken rule there.
That wasn't even a rule to your list. Why would I be talking about your first place tie? I'm obviously bringing up Battle for Bikini Bottom being the exact thing you said you wouldn't be putting on your list. Doodle, do you even pay attention to what it is that goes on in the videos you cover? You can see it in some of her other lists, but this one was the most egregious example.
Hey, Robot, that's great and all, except no one has any idea what you'd be talking about, given never in this entire list did you bring up examples to prove that these issues arise in my other videos. If you're gonna make such a bold claim like that, fucking prove it.
I'm getting a case of deja vu. Didn't I already point out how I was informing people that if they go to any of your other countdowns they would see the same issues? I feel like I've done that already. Honestly, I don't ever see Doodle improving, but maybe we can convince her to disown a countdown. After all, she typically does that with her commentaries.
Gee, that's not a toxic ending or anything. Sure do love that criticism. Up there with your voice changer's annoying, or draw anatomy better because it looks like an autistic Spurg drew it. But even the previous examples are at least an attempt to critique. This is just an intent to belittle other content creators that you don't like.
Then prove me wrong and improve your content. You've been staying in this stagnation of rushed commentaries that focus on quantity over quality for 2 years now, and I'm not the only one to have pointed this out. Oh wait, you still haven't watched the video that Kid Douglas made on you, have you? You still constantly do the same shit you promise yourself not to do, you still cause all sorts of drama because you spurg out on live streams. The criticism that's between the lines, that you're obviously too stupid to get, is to take problems people have with you and iron out those very same problems. I can tell for certain in this very video that you refuse to improve, because of the other examples to criticism against you. The voice and avatar sprites you've drawn are actual criticisms people have apparently gave to you that you just brush off because, why exactly? If you're really trying to improve your commentaries, you'd lower the pitch of your voice changer, or alternatively turn it off, and fix your fucking anatomy in your art. Hell, you watched Sketch TB's video on you, he even gave you the criticism to put more effort and spend more time on your videos, which you still have seemed to ignore, since your video on me was released only 5 days from No True Art Thieves, your last 20-minute commentary. I'm not counting your half-assed video on Phantom Strider because 1. I don't care, and 2. It's only 5 minutes, it has an excuse being released a day after. So you want to prove me wrong? Prove me wrong, don't spurg out because, my toxicity.
I'd suggest you drop the toxic attitude. If you're here to help people, then just saying herder they won't improve so let's get them to hate their videos is destructive. I'm not the only one who's noticed this, but when it comes to particularly me, you don't give a shit to actually try to make me a better commentator or a better content creator in general.
Because you wouldn't listen to any advice I would give.
You really need to give a shit about what you're commentating on, else what the fuck is the point?
The point is to show others how disingenuous you are, and how shitty you are as a content creator, because more people honestly need to have light shed on how much you refuse to improve.